All right, so let's learn a little bit about some typical features and some facts about street gangs. Now, for the most part, people that talk about this type of gang activity, sometimes they call them street gangs, sometimes they call them youth gangs. Uh, you can kind of think of those things fairly interchangeably, at least for the purposes of this lecture. Now, the graph that I have here to show you is just a bar graph showing you, in terms of the typical ages of gang members, the average percentage of gang members that are part of each age group. And all I wanted you to see here is that the really overwhelming majority of people who are in gangs, over 50% of them, are about 15 to 17 years old. In other words, what I wanted you to see here is this idea that membership in gangs is pretty short really showing up in the data. You don't see a lot of 25-year-old gang members, people that would consider themselves really active members of street gangs. It's much shorter lived of a lifestyle than tends to necessarily always get portrayed. It doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that always consider themselves gang affiliated and kind of come back to the activity once in a while. But in terms of kind of full-time, all-the-time membership, your typical gang member is somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. A lot of the information that we get about gangs is collected in a national sample, a national data collection called the National Youth Gang Survey. And it's something that was in existence in terms of getting collected on each year from 1996 to 2009. Unfortunately, we don't collect it, we currently aren't collecting data on it. They haven't been funded for the past couple years, but really provided some very interesting and kind of unique looks at gang life in the United States. So just to give you some ideas about how big a problem this is, is the gang, how large of a problem are gangs? I wanted to give you some data and a picture of essentially the trends that we've observed in the past decade or so in terms of how many, how many problems out there are attributed to gangs. And really what you can see is that in the early 1990s into the mid 1990s, when this data started collecting, gangs were really a huge problem. They were making up about 40% of the problems recorded in research. Saw a pretty significant decline into the early 2000s, which kind of makes sense when you think about just crime data in general. One kind of interesting thing that's happened though in the past couple years, and big aggregate crime data doesn't necessarily completely explain it, is the fact that gang activity has been on the rise again. From 2001 to 2005, there was kind of a sudden upturn, and it's leveled off a bit. But if you look at the chart below, it's leveled off at a higher number than I think most people would expect, given the amount of crime we currently have in any given year. So, in other words, what I just want to be clear on what this table is showing you. It's showing you how many law enforcement agencies within a given year are reporting a gang problem in their area. So if you look at it, in 1996, 40% of all the law enforcement agencies in our country reported having a gang problem. That dipped down to below 25% in 2000, but only a few years ago in 2009, it was back up to right around 35%. So some recent gang estimates in terms of how many gangs are there actually out there and how many gang members are actually in operation in any given year. You can imagine that that's a very hard number to actually try to come up with in an accurate way. Nobody's going to go out there and get a really accurate count of how many people in a community are gang members. It's a number that fluctuates and changes on a weekly, monthly basis. But the most recent estimates that we've come up with for this is that there are about 28,000 gangs actively at any time in the United States. And those gangs have about 731,000 members. Obviously, what tends to be the case is there are a few gangs that have quite a few members that are nationally, they have national kind of chapters of them. And then you have a lot of kind of small-time individual city gangs that are restricted to individual cities that have smaller numbers of gang members. Now, the fact that gangs engage in criminal activity is a feature, it's a criteria to be called a gang. But the reasons why certain gang-related crimes arise are not always the same. So again, this is still taking data from the National Youth Gang Survey, and what I wanted to show you is what this chart shows are the top reasons that law enforcement officials believe gang-related violence occurs. So what are the motivations behind the violence that we're recording on a daily basis? And I really just wanted you to take a look at the top three in this chart. The top three reasons that law enforcement officials report you can attribute to gang violence are drug-related factors. That shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Intergang conflicts, and people returning from confinement. I thought that third one was kind of interesting, that a lot of the violence that arises with either within or between gangs has to do with the fact that there is a lot of people coming in and out of gangs and going in and out of prisons and jails. It's not really something you think about when you put someone in prison for a year, what impact they're going to have 12 months later on violent crime in the area. But one thing that we know from from this data is that that does seem to be quite a problem. People clashing who haven't been around each other for a while. So as I've said a few times during this lecture so far, most people who do research on gangs look at gangs in cities. They look at urban street gangs. And historically, the reason for that is that's where most people believe that the majority of gang activity is going on. So that's why research is focused on it. But what's been interesting, especially in the past decade or so, is the fact that this really is changing, and gangs are not just an urban phenomenon, and their presence isn't just an urban phenomenon anymore. One thing that we've been noticing, especially in the DC area, is the fact that gangs that used to predominantly be in certain quadrants of Washington, D.C. are spreading out to the suburbs. So just to give you an idea of what we know about the spread of gangs away from cities, in terms of looking back again at the past decade, looking from 2002 to 2007, all areas saw an increase. If you remember looking at the aggregate numbers, that shouldn't be a surprise. But what really surprised law enforcement officials and people collecting this data was the fact that it wasn't increasing that much in the cities. 12% increase in the gang population in cities over these 5 years, but a 33% increase in suburban counties and 24% increase in rural counties. So we know essentially that gangs are spreading. They're not just being contained within urban areas anymore. Just think about for yourself, what might be some factors that might be leading to that? Why might it be the case that gangs are no longer just staying in urban areas, but are becoming more suburban and rural? What factors, what elements of progress over the past couple decades might be leading to this? Some ideas. This is an open question. We don't know for sure why this is happening, but one thing that we know is happening in terms of population changes is the fact that there's been kind of an outward migration of lower income residents out of urban centers and into suburban areas in the past couple years. Just as when you think about things like gentrification and urban renewal projects within cities, one of the kind of downsides of that is it pushes people out of urban areas where they can't afford to live anymore, leaving kind of the suburban areas directly outside of the cities more affordable housing. So that's one suggestion, is this whole entire population has kind of had a slow, gradual shift over time. A lot of people have also talked about the fact that there's just not enough room in urban centers for all of these competing gangs to get enough space to sell their product, to whatever it is they're doing. So they've resorted to going out into the suburbs, which is fairly open, unclaimed terrain. And when you think about the advancements that have been made in terms of public transportation in urban centers in the past couple decades, just easier to get around now. It's easier for gangs to have activities in multiple parts of the cities. Using cell phones, using text messaging, being able to spread out more is necessarily going to mean that suburbia and even rural counties in America are going to have a gang presence. We know very little about it, though. It's something that doesn't get nearly as much research as maybe it should, especially when you think about the fact that the gang populations in these kind of counties is where gang activity is increasing the most. And in terms of gangs and their relationship with crime and law enforcement, it's probably not a surprise to realize that people who are gang members, not just gang affiliated, but people who are in gangs, commit crimes at higher rates than any other group of people that you might be able to segregate people into in our population. And there are really few law enforcement agencies that really give us a completely thorough understanding of just how much crime is actually gang related. Because when you think about when a crime gets recorded, let's say there's a shootout between two rival gangs and it results in somebody from one of the gangs being shot and killed. Well, when the police arrive on the scene of an incident like that, it's very hard for them to tell exactly what's going on. They might be able to suppose and infer something, but in terms of what's going to go into official data, it's just going to go down as a homicide. It's really hard to tell from official data and reports what the relationship is between people, whether or not crimes are actually gang related. And we also know that gang crime can arise from really diverse sources. When you think about some of the different reasons why crimes might arise, it's not surprising that a lot of these reasons result in kind of violent outbursts. Rivalries between gangs, trying to get territory, land, corners to sell product. I mean, that's something that's not going to go away. And if these gangs have a problem with each other, it's not like they can call the police to deal with it. They have to deal with it violently between each other because they're already acting outside of the law. The drug market is always going to be something that incites gang violence. And just in terms of thinking about not even just kind of larger level battles going on between gangs, but there's also a lot of individual kind of solitary crimes that, even though on the surface it might not look like a gang-related incident, it actually does have gang undertones. Seeking revenge against someone who disrespected you, someone who tried to hit on your girlfriend, steal your girlfriend away from you. Arguments like that are arising between rival gang members, but it's very hard for somebody on the outside to have a full understanding of that and record it. So the point is, we know the gang members are committing a lot more crime than everyone else, but we still don't have a really accurate, complete picture of exactly what percentage of all crimes you really can attribute to gang activity. Because every number we've come up with so far is probably a pretty big underestimate.